Tonight you find yourself not in your own bed, but on a sun-baked hillside overlooking Athens, the air thick with the scent of thyme and pine, the distant murmur of the agora drifting up like bees humming in a lavender field. You're lying on a rough woolen blanket spread across stones still warm from the afternoon sun, your head propped on a bundle of fabric that might once have been someone's himation, and you're supposed to be listening to a philosopher. Instead, your eyelids are staging a quiet rebellion. The speaker's voice has become a rhythmic drone, rising and falling like the cicadas soaring away in the olive groves behind you. And somewhere between his explanation of the four causes and his tangent about the best figs in the Piraeus, you've lost the thread entirely. Your chin dips, jerks up, dips again. And here's the thing the philosopher notices, the thing he's been waiting for. He smiles, lowers his voice even further, and carries on talking as if nothing has happened. Because in this moment, your drifting mind is exactly where it needs to be. This is Athens in the 4th century BCE. And you're about to discover that the power nap wasn't invented by some modern productivity guru with a podcast and a sponsorship from a mattress company. It was philosophy's best-kept secret, a tool for clarity and insight that the greatest thinkers in history understood instinctively. And you probably won't survive this without wanting to close your eyes, which is entirely the point. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now, dim the lights, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The philosopher on the hillside is named Ariston, and he's what you'd call a minor figure in the grand sweep of Greek thought. The kind of person who appears in exactly one surviving fragment of text and then vanishes like morning mist. But today he's your teacher, and what he's teaching isn't written in any scroll. He's demonstrating something about the relationship between the conscious mind and the vast, murky territory that lies just beyond its reach. You're not actually asleep, not yet. You're in that floating space where thoughts lose their sharp edges and start to drift apart like clouds, where the philosopher's words become sounds first and meaning second, where the warmth of the stone beneath you and the distant bleating of a goat and the honey-colored light filtering through your eyelids all blend together into a single sensation that has no name. This is the hypnagogic state, the threshold of sleep, and the Greeks had a word for it that doesn't translate neatly into English. They called it hypnos when you crossed over completely, but the space just before, that liminal territory, they understood as a place where the soul could slip its moorings and catch glimpses of truths that rational thought could never grasp. Ariston knows this because his teacher knew it, and his teacher's teacher knew it. And somewhere back in the chain of transmission there's a line that connects this afternoon nap to the oldest wisdom of the Mediterranean world. He's not offended that you're drowsy. He's encouraged. He lowers his voice to match your fading consciousness, drawing you deeper not into sleep but into that specific kind of wakefulness that hovers on the edge of it, where your defenses drop and your mind becomes porous. You try to focus. You really do. You catch fragments. Something about the nature of change, something about whether a man can step in the same river twice, something about the gods and their indifference to human affairs. But the fragments are dissolving, the edges blurring, and you're becoming aware of sensations you normally filter out. The tiny pulse of blood in your fingertips, the weight of your own rib cage rising and falling, the distant sound of your own breathing as if it belongs to someone else. This is what Ariston wants you to notice. This expanded awareness that comes not from straining toward knowledge but from relaxing into ignorance, from letting go of the need to grasp and control and categorize. You're not learning philosophy right now. You're becoming the kind of person who might someday understand it. The afternoon deepens around you. Shadows lengthen across the hillside, and somewhere in the city below, a woman begins to sing, a fragment of a song about Persephone and the pomegranate seeds, about descent and return, about what happens when you spend time in the realm of sleep and emerge again into the light. The song drifts up to you like smoke, and in your drowsy state it seems to be about you, about this very moment, about the wisdom that comes only when you're willing to let go of waking consciousness for a while. Ariston has stopped talking now, or maybe he hasn't. You can't quite tell anymore, but it doesn't matter because the lesson has moved beyond words. The lesson is the silence between words, the pause between thoughts, the 15-minute nap that resets the mind and leaves it clearer than before. When you finally open your eyes, blinking against the golden light, Ariston is watching you with an expression you can't quite read. He doesn't ask if you were listening. He doesn't test you on what he said. Instead, he hands you a piece of bread and a dried fig, and he gestures toward the path that leads back down to the city. Tomorrow, he says, we'll discuss what you learned while you weren't listening. And you realize, with a start, that you have no idea what that might be, but you're strangely eager to find out. You wake the next morning in a room that smells of wool and lamp smoke and the faint, lingering tang of last night's wine. And for a moment you have no idea where you are. Then memory returns in fragments. The hillside, the philosopher, the strange lesson in not listening that left you more confused than enlightened. Today, you've been told, you'll visit the school of a man who died a century before you were born. A man whose name still carries weight in every corner of the Greek world. Pythagoras. You pull on your sandals, splash water on your face from a clay jug in the corner, and step out into a morning already warm with promise. The streets of Athens are waking around you, merchants setting up their stalls, slaves fetching water from the public fountains, dogs fighting over scraps in the alleyways. You make your way toward the edge of the city, where a small group of students gathers outside a house that looks unremarkable except for the strange symbol painted above the door. A pentagram, its lines intersecting in perfect geometry. The Pythagoreans, you've heard, are secretive. They don't write down their teachings, they don't admit just anyone to their inner circles, and they hold to rules that seem bizarre to outsiders. Don't eat beans, don't stir fire with iron, don't look in a mirror by lamplight. But they also possess knowledge that no one else has, wisdom about numbers and music and the structure of the cosmos that they claim came directly from the gods. And today, through connections you don't quite understand, you've been granted entry to one of their morning gatherings. The student who greets you at the door is young, barely out of boyhood, with the intense, slightly haunted look of someone who spends too much time thinking about eternal truths. He leads you through a narrow corridor into a courtyard where half a dozen men sit on cushions arranged in a circle, their eyes closed, their breathing slow and regular. No one speaks. You're gestured to an empty cushion, and you sit, unsure what's expected of you. The silence stretches, becomes uncomfortable, then begins to shift into something else, something almost physical, a presence in the space between you. You become aware of your own breathing, the way it syncs or fails to sync with the breathing of the men around you. Your mind, restless and questioning, starts to quiet not because you're forcing it but because there's nothing else to do. Minutes pass. The sun climbs higher, throwing sharp shadows across the courtyard stones. And then, without any signal you can detect, all 6 men open their eyes at exactly the same moment, as if they've been following a clock that only they can hear. The oldest among them, a man with a grey beard and eyes that seem to look through you rather than at you, begins to speak. He doesn't introduce himself or explain what just happened. Instead, he starts talking about numbers, not as abstractions, not as tools for counting sheep or measuring grain, but as living realities, as the actual substance of which the universe is made. Number, he says, is the principle of all things. Number is limit imposed on the unlimited, form imposed on the formless. Number is what allows the cosmos to exist at all, rather than dissolving into the boundless chaos that preceded it. You nod along, understanding the words but not their meaning, when he says something that snaps your attention into sharp focus. And this is why we practice in cosmosis, he says. This is why we lie down in the middle of the day and allow the mind to approach the boundary of sleep. The word is unfamiliar, but you recognize its roots, en, meaning in or within, and cosmos, meaning order or world. In cosmosis, entering into order, settling into the structure of things. And what it means, the old man explains, is that the space between waking and sleeping is not empty but full of mathematical truths that the conscious mind is too busy, too active, too cluttered to perceive. When you fall asleep at night, you plunge into darkness, into formlessness, into the unlimited that precedes all creation. But when you merely nap, when you hover at the threshold, you position yourself exactly at the point where limit meets the unlimited, where number emerges from the void. In that state, if you're properly trained, you can perceive the structure of reality directly, without the distortion of rational thought. Historians still argue whether Pythagoras himself taught this doctrine or whether it was developed by his followers in the generations after his death. The surviving fragments are ambiguous, the testimonies contradictory, and the Pythagoreans' habit of attributing all their discoveries to the master himself makes it impossible to know for certain. But what's clear is that by the 4th century BCE, the school had developed elaborate practices around this threshold state. Practices that involve precise timing, specific postures, and a whole taxonomy of the different kinds of visions that could appear to the properly prepared mind. You learn that the ideal nap, according to these mathematicians of consciousness, lasts exactly as long as it takes to count to 900, about 15 minutes, though they measure it by breath rather than by any external clock. Longer than that, and you slip into true sleep, losing the connection to the ordering principle. Shorter, and you haven't fully released the grip of waking consciousness. The old man gestures to the youngest student, the one who greeted you at the door. The boy lies down on a simple mat, closes his eyes, and within moments his breathing shifts into the rhythm of early sleep. The rest of you watch in silence, and you're struck by how vulnerable he looks, how trusting, lying there with his throat exposed, his hands open at his sides, his face slack and defenseless. "This is part of it too," the old man murmurs. To nap in the company of others is to practice trust, to surrender the illusion of individual control and submit to the shared order of the cosmos. The boy isn't alone, even though his consciousness has withdrawn. He's held by the circle, by the attention of the group, by the mathematical harmony that connects all waking minds even when they seem separate. After exactly the time it takes to count to 900, the old man counts silently. You can see his lips moving, the boy's eyes open. He sits up slowly, blinking, and for a moment his expression is blank, empty, as if he's forgotten who he is or where he belongs. Then recognition returns, and with it a smile, and he turns to the old man and begins to describe what he saw. "Numbers," he says. "Patterns. A grid of light that extended in all directions, with points of brightness at the intersections. And at the center of the grid, something like a musical chord made visible, a harmony of colored fire." The old man nods, satisfied. "Good," he says. "You're learning to see." And you realize, with a strange pang of something like envy, that this is what passes for education among the Pythagoreans. Not arguments and debates, not reading and writing, but the systematic exploration of the territory between waking and sleeping, the mapping of the threshold where number pours itself into form. The morning after your encounter with the Pythagoreans, you find yourself walking the dusty road to Eleusis, not as a pilgrim seeking initiation into the famous mysteries but as a student of something stranger, a philosophy that treats the space between waking and sleeping as a doorway to the divine. Your guide today is a woman named Diotima, though she's quick to tell you she's not the famous Diotima from Plato's dialogue, the one who taught Socrates about love. She's just someone who inherited the name and, with it, a certain expectation of wisdom. She walks ahead of you with the easy stride of someone who's spent her life on these roads, her himation hitched up to free her legs, a staff in her hand that she uses more for gesticulating than for support. The pre-Socratics, she's saying, understood something that the Athenians have largely forgotten. They knew that the gods don't speak to people who are fully awake. You pass a field where slaves are harvesting olives, beating the branches with long sticks while women spread cloths on the ground to catch the falling fruit. The air smells of dust and crushed leaves and the distant salt of the sea. Diotima gestures toward the workers with her staff. "Look at them," she says. "Completely present, completely in their bodies, their minds occupied with nothing but the task at hand. Do you think the gods have anything to say to them? You're not sure if this is a rhetorical question or a test, so you stay silent. No, she answers for you. The gods speak to people whose minds are empty enough to listen. Not asleep. Asleep is too far gone, too deep into the realm of Hades. But empty. Still. Poised on the edge. She takes you to a spring that bubbles out of a hillside. Its water's so clear you can see every pebble at the bottom. This, she says, is a sacred spot. Though no temple marks it, no priest tends it. The pre-Socratics would come here to drink and then to lie down in the shade of the olive trees that surround the spring, letting the sound of the water carry them towards sleep without quite letting them arrive. They called this state in hypnein, being in sleep, but not of it, and they believed that in this condition the soul could travel, could visit the gods on their own terms and bring back messages that would be incomprehensible to the waking mind. You have to understand, Diotima says, settling herself on a flat rock beside the spring and gesturing for you to do the same, that for these early thinkers, the boundary between human and divine was porous. Not like today, with your philosophers arguing about whether the gods care about us or whether they even exist. Back then, everyone knew the gods were real, and everyone knew they were dangerous. The question was how to approach them safely. She tells you about Fairsides of Syros, a 6th century sage who was said to have predicted earthquakes and interpreted dreams and generally moved through the world with one foot in the human realm and one in something else entirely. Fairsides, according to the stories, used to take regular afternoon naps during which his soul would leave his body and converse with divine beings. His students would guard his sleeping form, warding off anything that might disturb his journey, and when he woke he would dictate whatever the gods had told him. Some of these dictations became the basis for his book on cosmology, one of the first prose works in Greek literature, though only fragments survive. Imagine, Diotima says, her voice dropping to something like a whisper, lying down in the middle of the day, closing your eyes, and simply leaving. Going somewhere else entirely. Coming back with knowledge that no human could have discovered through thinking alone. You try to imagine it, and you find that you can, lying here by this spring, the sound of water filling your ears, the warmth of the sun through the olive leaves, the sense of your body becoming heavier and more distant with each breath. You're not asleep, not yet, but you're not quite awake either, and in that space you become aware of something you can't name, a presence or a possibility that hovers just at the edge of perception. Diotima watches you with a slight smile. There, she says quietly. You're doing it. You're approaching the threshold. Don't try to cross it. Just stay here, on this side, and see what comes to you. What comes to you is nothing dramatic, no vision of gods or journey of the soul. Just a deepening of the moment, a sense that the spring and the trees and the distant sound of the harvesters are all part of something larger, something that includes you without being centered on you. You feel yourself dissolving, just a little, the boundaries between inside and outside becoming less certain. And in that dissolution, you understand something that wasn't there a moment ago, that the self you normally experience, the you that thinks and chooses and worries about the future, is just a surface phenomenon, a thin film stretched over depths that you never normally visit. The nap, the threshold state, is a way of puncturing that film, of letting the depths rise up and inform the surface without overwhelming it. Historians still argue about whether the pre-Socratics actually practiced deliberate napping as a philosophical technique or whether the stories about Fairsides and others are later inventions, projections of Plato's and Aristotle's interests onto earlier figures for whom sleep was simply sleep. The evidence is fragmentary, the interpretations contested, and the whole question is tangled up with larger debates about the origins of Greek philosophy itself. But Diotima, lying on her rock beside the spring, couldn't care less about any of that. What matters, she says, is not what they did or didn't do. What matters is whether you can do it. Whether you can lie down in the middle of the day, open yourself to whatever comes, and return with something worth having. Everything else is just scholarship. She closes her eyes then, and within moments her breathing has shifted into the rhythm of the threshold. You watch her for a while, this woman who shares a name with a famous philosopher, and you wonder what she's seeing on the other side of her eyelids. Then you lie back on your own rock, let the sound of the spring fill your ears, and drift toward whatever might be waiting for you there. The afternoon passes like water through fingers. When you finally open your eyes, the shadows have lengthened and diatimer is gone, but there's a fig placed on the rock beside you, perfectly ripe, and you understand that this is her way of saying you did it right. The end comes quietly, as endings often do in places like this. You find him one morning in the vegetable patch, kneeling among the cabbages as though he'd simply stopped to rest and forgotten to get up again. His eyes are open, looking at something you can't see, and his hands are still half raised in the gesture of someone about to pick something, to tend something, to continue the endless work of caring for this place. You kneel beside him and touch his shoulder, and his cold, colder than the morning air can account for, and you understand that he's been here for hours, maybe all night, watching the stars wheel overhead while the life slowly left his body. The cabbages around him are untouched, unharvested, still growing toward a future he won't share. You sit with him for a long time, not sure what to do, not sure what comes next. The birds sing. The sun rises. The world continues as though nothing has changed. And in a way, nothing has. The garden is still here. The cottage is still here. The trees are still growing. Only one small thing is missing. One small presence that made all the difference. You bury him in the grove he planted, under the central hawthorn where you found him that winter night so many years ago. It feels right, though you're not sure why, something about returning him to the place he made, the living thing he created that will outlast him by decades or centuries. You dig the hole yourself, slowly, giving the work the same attention he gave everything, feeling the soil change as you go deeper, dark and rich near the surface where the leaves have fallen and rotted for years, paler and harder below, finally the clay that underlies everything here. You wrap him in his own blanket, the one he carried here 40 years ago, and lower him into the ground and cover him with the same soil he's worked for most of his adult life. You mark the spot with a stone from his collection, the spiral fossil he kept on the windowsill, and you stand there for a long time not knowing what to say, what to do, how to end something that never really had a beginning. The question of what he left behind is harder than you expected. There's no will, no instructions, no list of wishes for what should happen to this place. There's just the garden, the cottage, the trees, and you, temporary custodian of something you didn't build and don't fully understand. You stay for a while, tending things as he would have tended them, trying to feel his presence in the work the way you always did. But it's not the same. The silence is different now, emptier, less companionable. The garden doesn't need you the way it needed him. The trees don't know your name. The cottage feels like a museum, a monument to a life that's over, not a home for a life that's still being lived. You know you'll have to leave eventually, return to your own world, your own life, whatever's left of it after all these years away. But not yet. Not quite yet. There's still work to do here. Still things that need attention before you can let them go. Historians still argue about what his life meant, what legacy he left behind, whether any of it mattered in the great sweep of human history. You think about this as you walk through the garden one last time, touching the plants he planted, feeling the soil he worked, remembering the hundreds of small moments that added up to a life. He didn't write books or found institutions or change any laws. He didn't have children or students or followers. He didn't do anything that will appear in history books or get taught in schools. But he did something else, something harder to measure. He lived a life of complete integrity, every moment aligned with his deepest values, every action and expression of who he really was. He showed that it's possible to opt out, to say no to the endless demands and distractions of the world, to build something real and lasting with nothing but patience and attention and time. And maybe that's enough. Maybe that's more than enough. You find the letter in the wooden box, the one from his sister, still folded in its original creases, still carrying the sketch of 2 children in a garden. You take it with you when you leave, along with the spiral fossil and a small cutting from the hawthorn tree. You don't know why. Some things don't need reasons. The path to the clearing is almost gone now, grown over so thoroughly that you have to push through branches and step over fallen logs to find your way out. By the time you reach the edge of the woods, you can barely see where you came from. By the time you reach the road, you're not sure it was ever there at all. But you carry the proof in your pocket, the fossil, the cutting, the letter from a sister who probably died years ago, never knowing what became of her brother. You'll plant the cutting somewhere. You decide. Somewhere it can grow, can become part of a different garden, can carry a little piece of this place into whatever future awaits. And you'll tell the story, sometimes, to people who might understand. Not the whole story. You're not sure you know the whole story anymore. Just enough to let them know that such a life is possible, that somewhere in the woods of Surrey an old man once chose silence over everything else, and that his choice mattered, even if no one can say exactly why. Historians still argue about whether Plato's portrayal of Socrates is accurate or whether he used his teacher as a mouthpiece for his own ideas. The question is probably unanswerable, lost in the gap between the living man and the literary character who bears his name. But sitting here in this alley, watching Plato's face as he remembers his teacher, you're struck by something that feels like truth regardless of historical accuracy. That whatever Socrates was really like, he inspired in his students a way of approaching the world that included space for not knowing, for letting go, for the wisdom that comes only when you stop trying to be wise. And that way of approaching the world included, necessarily and deliberately, the art of the 15-minute nap. Plato stands, stretching like a cat waking from a long sleep. "I have to go," he says. "There are young men waiting at the academy who think they're going to learn something today. Poor fools." He grins, and for a moment he looks exactly like the young man who fell asleep against this wall, carefree and unguarded. "But you should come sometime. We nap in the afternoons, after the morning discussions and before the evening walks. It's the best part of the curriculum, though we don't advertise it." He starts to walk away, then stops and turns back. "One more thing. That scroll I dropped, the one you saw when you found me. It's not important. It's just words. What matters is what happened in the few minutes before you arrived, when I wasn't thinking about anything at all. Remember that." And then he's gone, swallowed by the crowd, leaving you alone in the alley with nothing but a new understanding of what philosophy might really mean. The Academy Grove lies just outside Athens' walls, a sanctuary of olive trees and quiet paths where generations of young men have come to stretch their minds under the patient guidance of older ones. You approach it on a morning still heavy with dew, the air cool and fragrant with the scent of damp earth and the first hints of the herbs that grow wild between the trees. A stone wall marks the boundary, low enough to step over but clearly intended to separate this space from the ordinary world beyond. You step over it anyway, because that's what boundaries are for, and find yourself in a different kind of place entirely. One where the sounds of the city fade to a distant murmur and the only voices are human ones, raised in argument or lowered in contemplation, drifting through the trees like the ghosts of conversations past. Plato had invited you to come, had more or less insisted, and now here you are, wandering the paths of his famous school with no clear idea of where to go or what to do. Students pass you in small groups, some deep in discussion, others walking in companionable silence. No one questions your presence. The academy is open to anyone with the curiosity to seek it out, but no one offers guidance either. You're left to find your own way, which you suspect is part of the education. Eventually you come to a clearing where a dozen or so young men sit on stone benches arranged in a semicircle, and at the center of the semicircle stands a man you recognize. Plato himself, looking considerably more awake than when you found him napping in that alley. He sees you and gestures you forward without pausing his lecture. And so the visible world, the world we perceive with our senses, is not the real world at all. It's a shadow, a copy, an imperfect reflection of a higher reality that can only be grasped by the mind. The forms, the true reality of things, exist in a realm beyond space and time, accessible only to reason. The philosopher's task is to turn away from the shadows on the cave wall and ascend toward the light. He pauses, looking directly at you. But here's the question that none of my students ever ask. How does one make that ascent? How does the mind, trapped in a body that hungers and sleeps and dies, manage to glimpse the eternal? The students shift on their benches, waiting for the answer they assume is coming. But Plato doesn't answer. Instead, he does something strange. He sits down on the grass, right there in front of everyone, and closes his eyes. For a long moment, nothing happens. The students exchange glances, uncertain whether this is part of the lesson or a sign that their teacher has finally lost his mind. Then, one by one, they begin to do the same, sitting, closing their eyes, letting the silence settle over them like a blanket. You hesitate, feeling like an intruder on something private, but eventually you lower yourself to the grass and let your own eyes close. The sounds of the grove assert themselves in the absence of vision. Birds calling overhead, the rustle of wind through olive leaves, the distant murmur of other students elsewhere in the grounds. Your breathing slows. Your thoughts, initially resistant, begin to drift and scatter. You're not asleep. You're pretty sure you're not asleep, but you're not quite awake either, not in the normal sense. You're somewhere else, somewhere between, and in that somewhere you become aware of Plato's voice again, softer now, speaking as if from a great distance. This is what I mean, he says, when I talk about turning away from the shadows. Not reasoning. Reasoning is still bound to the world, still caught up in the play of appearances. But this letting go, this willingness to release the grip of consciousness, this is the beginning of the ascent. Because in this state, the mind is no longer distracted by the particular, by this tree and that bird and this thought and that sensation. It becomes capable of receiving the universal, the form that underlies all particular trees and birds and thoughts. Not by thinking about it, but by being open to it. You try to grasp what he's saying, but grasping is exactly the wrong response. The moment you reach for understanding, it slips away, replaced by the ordinary noise of your own mental chatter. So you let go again, let yourself drift back toward that threshold, and this time something different happens. The boundaries between you and the world begin to dissolve, not dramatically, not in any way you could describe to someone else, but subtly, like sugar dissolving in warm water. You're still you, but you're also the grass beneath you, the air moving across your skin, the sound of Plato's voice and the silence between his words. And in that dissolution, you catch a glimpse of something that might be what he calls a form. Not the idea of justice, exactly, but the quality of justness that makes just acts just. Not the concept of beauty, but the beauty that beautiful things participate in. It's there for an instant, then gone, and you're back in your body on the grass with the sounds of the grove filling your ears. Plato is speaking again. His voice returned to its normal register. You see? You can't force it. You can't achieve it through effort or discipline or the accumulation of knowledge. All you can do is prepare the ground, create the conditions, and wait. And one of the conditions, one of the most important conditions, is this willingness to approach sleep without quite entering it. To let the mind become receptive rather than active. To nap, in other words, with intention and attention. He opens his eyes and looks around at his students, many of whom are still hovering on the threshold themselves, their faces slack and peaceful. The Pythagoreans understood this, he continues. They built their whole philosophy around the states between waking and sleeping, around the visions that come to the properly prepared mind. And my teacher Socrates understood it too, though he never talked about it publicly. But I'll tell you something that might surprise you. The most important insights I've ever had about the forms came not while I was thinking, not while I was arguing, not even while I was writing. They came in those moments just after waking or just before sleeping, when the mind is still porous, still connected to something larger than itself. They came during naps. Historians still argue about whether Plato actually incorporated napping into the curriculum of the Academy or whether this is a later Romantic invention, a projection of modern concerns onto an ancient institution. The evidence is thin, the source is ambiguous, and the whole question is complicated by Plato's own ambivalence about the body and its demands. After all, this is the philosopher who called the body the prison house of the soul, who saw physical existence as an obstacle to be overcome rather than a condition to be embraced. Would such a thinker really have endorsed something as bodily, as physical, as lying down in the middle of the day and closing your eyes? But sitting here in the grove, watching these young men drift peacefully on the edge of sleep, you're not so sure the contradiction is as sharp as it seems. Maybe the body isn't just a prison. Maybe it's also a doorway. Maybe the path to the forms leads through, not away from, the simple physical act of resting, of letting go, of trusting that the mind will find its way even when you're not steering. Plato rises, brushing grass from his himation, and gestures for the students to do the same. Enough for now, he says. Go eat, go walk, go think about what you've experienced. We'll continue this discussion after the midday rest. And as the students disperse, drifting away through the trees in twos and threes, you realize that the midday rest isn't a break from the curriculum. It is the curriculum. The afternoon sun hangs heavy over the Lyceum, that other great school on the other side of Athens, and you're walking its shaded peripatos with a man who seems to be thinking about everything at once. Aristotle walks beside you, though walks might be too mild a word. He strides, he gestures, he stops abruptly to examine a leaf or a beetle or a patch of moss, he scribbles notes on a wax tablet with a stylus he keeps tucked behind his ear, he mutters observations to himself as if you're not even there. This is the man who tutored Alexander the Great, who wrote more books than anyone could read in a lifetime, who seems determined to categorize and explain every single thing that exists in the entire cosmos. And right now, improbably, he's talking about naps. The problem with my predecessors, Aristotle says, not for the first time, is that they were too eager to reach for the divine, the eternal, the transcendent. They wanted to leap straight from the cave to the sun, from the shadow to the form, without bothering to understand the shadow first. But the shadow is real. The shadow has its own nature, its own principles, its own place in the order of things. You cannot understand the form of tree without understanding this particular olive tree, here, now, with its gnarled trunk and its silver-green leaves and the way its roots grip the soil of the Lyceum. He gestures at a nearby olive as if to say case in point, and you nod, though you're not entirely sure where this is going. He stops walking, turns to face you, and fixes you with that intense stare that his students have learned to both dread and crave. Sleep, he says. What is sleep? My teacher Plato would tell you it's a falling away from the real, a descent into the shadow realm, a necessary evil that the soul endures because it's trapped in a body. But that's poetry, not philosophy. I want to know what sleep actually is. I want to know its causes, its functions, its proper place in the life of a human being. I want to know why we sleep, how much we need, and what happens when we don't get enough. And I want to know about this thing you've been exploring, this threshold state, this nap, and whether it has its own nature or is merely a defective form of either waking or sleeping. You've been in Athens long enough now to recognize a rhetorical question when you hear one, so you stay silent and let Aristotle answer himself. He doesn't disappoint. I've been collecting observations, he says, tapping his wax tablet. From my students, from travelers, from anyone who will talk to me. And what I'm finding is that sleep isn't simple. It's not just the absence of wakefulness. It's a positive state with its own characteristics, its own purposes, its own relationship to the other functions of the body. Digestion, for instance. Sleep aids digestion, everyone knows this. But why? Because the heat of the body retreats inward during sleep, concentrating around the stomach and intestines, allowing food to be properly concocted and transformed into blood and flesh. Too much sleep, though, and the heat retreats too far, leaving the extremities cold and the mind sluggish. The key is balance, as in all things. He starts walking again, and you fall into step beside him. Other students pass in small groups, some deep in conversation, others carrying specimens for Aristotle to examine. A jar of seawater, a pressed flower, a small animal in a cage. The Lyceum hums with the energy of investigation, of questions being asked and answers being tested, and you can feel it pulling at you, making you want to join in, to observe and classify and understand. But Aristotle isn't done with you yet. Now, this threshold state you've been experiencing, the one the Pythagoreans calling cosmosis and my teacher used in ways he never fully explained, I've been observing that too. On myself, on my students, on anyone who will let me watch them drift off. And what I'm finding is that it's not just a transition. It has its own physiology, its own psychology, its own proper duration. About 15 minutes seems to be the ideal length, long enough for the body to begin its retreat inward, for the digestive heat to concentrate and the senses to disengage, but not so long that the mind loses all contact with the external world. In that state, the imagination becomes active in a particular way, not dreaming, exactly, but something between dreaming and waking perception. Images arise, associations form, connections are made that wouldn't occur to the fully conscious mind. He stops again, this time at a bench shaded by a plane tree, and gestures for you to sit. Try it, he says. Right now. Lie down on that bench, it's long enough, I've tested it, and let yourself drift towards sleep. I'll watch, I'll time it, I'll note what happens. This is how we learn, how we understand. By observing, by recording, by comparing one instance with another. Your experience matters. Your nap will contribute to knowledge. You lie down on the bench, feeling slightly ridiculous but also strangely honored. The stone is warm from the sun, the plane tree's leaves rustle overhead, and somewhere in the distance you can hear the murmur of other students at their investigations. You close your eyes, let your breathing slow, and begin the familiar drift toward the threshold. This time, though, you're aware of being watched, of Aristotle's intense gaze tracking your every micro-movement, his stylus scratching occasionally on his tablet as he records some observation. It should be distracting, should pull you back to wakefulness, but instead it's oddly comforting. The knowledge that your experience matters, that this simple act of resting is being taken seriously as a subject of philosophical inquiry. You drift. Images come and go. A ship on a calm sea, a bird circling overhead, a face you can't quite place. They're not dreams, not narratives with beginnings and ends, just fragments floating through the space of your mind. And beneath them, or behind them, there's a sense of something else, a quality of awareness that's different from normal consciousness, more receptive, less grasping. You're not thinking about anything in particular, but you're not thinking either. You're just present, in a way that thinking never quite allows. A hand on your shoulder, gentle but insistent. You open your eyes to find Aristotle standing over you, his wax tablet covered with notes. 15 minutes exactly, he says. I counted your breaths, slowed from about 12 per minute to 8, then stabilized at 9. Your eyelids twitched occasionally, indicating the onset of what I'm calling the hypnagogic state, but you never entered full sleep. Your fingers relax completely after about 7 minutes. Your facial muscles followed at around 11 minutes. And he stops, seeing your expression. You want to know what I observed about your subjective experience? I can't observe that. Only you can report it. So report. You try to describe what you experienced, the floating images, the receptive awareness, the sense of being present without grasping. Aristotle listens intently, asking occasional questions, scribbling furiously. When you're done, he nods with what might be satisfaction. Good. This matches other reports I've collected. The pattern is consistent, about 15 minutes, the onset of imagery that's neither fully dream nor fully waking perception, a quality of awareness that subjects describe as receptive or open. This is a real phenomenon, with its own nature and its own function. It's not just a transition between states, it's a state in itself, worth studying for its own sake. Historians still argue about whether Aristotle ever wrote a proper treatise on sleep and dreaming, or whether the works that have come down to us under those titles are lecture notes compiled by students. The texts we have, on sleep, on dreams, on divination in sleep, are dense, technical, full of the kind of detailed observation and classification that characterize all of Aristotle's work. They don't mention the 15-minute nap specifically, but they lay the groundwork for understanding it. The physiology of sleep, the role of digestion, the activity of the imagination in the absence of external perception. And they make clear that for Aristotle, sleep wasn't a falling away from reality but a natural phenomenon with its own logic and purpose. He's still talking, still explaining, still connecting this observation to that theory, and you're trying to follow, but the nap has left you pleasantly drowsy, receptive in just the way he's been describing. You catch fragments, something about the heart as the seat of sensation, something about the cooling that accompanies sleep, something about the difference between dreams and the images that appear to the virtuous versus the vicious. It's fascinating, really it is, but your mind keeps drifting back to the bench, to those 15 minutes, to the sense that in letting go of thought you actually came closer to understanding than all this thinking could ever take you. The morning after your nap on Aristotle's bench, you find yourself walking again, but this time you're not alone. A small group of students has gathered at the entrance to the Lyceum, and they're moving with purpose toward the roads that lead out of Athens, into the countryside beyond. These are the peripatetics, the followers of Aristotle who take their name from the covered walkways where their master teaches, and they've invited you to join them on their daily constitutional. Walking, you've learned, is central to their philosophy, not just a way of getting from place to place, but a method of thinking, a rhythm that sets the mind free to range over whatever territory it chooses. And today, as you leave the city behind and strike out along a dirt track that winds through olive groves and past small farms, you begin to understand why. The student walking beside you is named Theophrastus, though everyone calls him Theos. He's Aristotle's favorite, the one who will eventually take over the Lyceum when his master dies, and he has the kind of mind that notices everything. The way the light falls on a particular rock, the call of a bird you can't see, the subtle shift in the soil as you move from one geological formation to another. Right now, though, he's not noticing any of that. He's talking about naps. You have to understand the timing, he says, gesturing with the staff he carries more for emphasis than support. We walk in the morning, when the mind is freshest and the body is still recovering from sleep. We discuss, we argue, we investigate, all the activities that require sharp attention and focused thought. Then, around midday, we return to the Lyceum. And then, he pauses dramatically, letting you fill in the blank. You nap, you say. We nap, he confirms. Not because we're lazy, not because we've exhausted our capacity for thought, but because the nap is the necessary complement to the walk. The walk generates ideas, throws them up like a plough turning soil. But ideas need time to settle, to take root, to connect with each other in ways that conscious thought can't direct. The nap provides that time. It's the fallow period, the rest between plantings, without which the soil would quickly become exhausted. You're walking through a landscape that seems designed to illustrate his point. The path rises gently, offering views of the sea in the distance, and the morning sun warms your shoulders without yet becoming oppressive. Farmers are at work in the fields, their movements slow and deliberate, and you can hear the distant bleating of goats from somewhere up ahead. The rhythm of walking, left, right, settles into your body, and you find your mind doing exactly what Theo's described. Ranging freely, making connections, generating ideas without any conscious effort. It's not that you're thinking about anything in particular. It's more that thinking is happening effortlessly, like breathing or the beating of your heart. We've been collecting data, Theos continues, and you recognize Aristotle's influence in that word data. Observations on the relationship between walking and subsequent sleep. What we're finding is that the quality of the nap, its depth, its duration, the kind of imagery that appears, depends on what happened during the walk. If we've been engaged in intense discussion, wrestling with difficult problems, the nap tends to be lighter, more porous, full of images related to the topics we were discussing. If we've been walking in silence, observing the world around us without trying to analyze it, the nap goes deeper, approaches more closely to actual sleep. Both are valuable. Both serve different purposes. You pass a small shrine to some rural god, its stones weathered and covered with lichen. One of the students ahead of you stops to leave a small offering, a few olives, a crust of bread, and you're struck by how natural it seems, how seamlessly this gesture of piety fits into the rhythm of the walk. The Peripatetics are philosophers, investigators of nature, but they're also Greeks, heirs to traditions that stretch back long before anyone thought to ask questions about the ultimate nature of reality. They walk past shrines and leave offerings and nap in the afternoon, and none of these activities seems to conflict with the others. Theos notices your attention and follows your gaze to the shrine. Aristotle says that the divine is present in all things, he remarks, not just in temples and statues. The order of nature is itself divine, the regular motions of the stars, the cycles of growth and decay, even the pattern of waking and sleeping that structures our days. To understand nature is to understand divinity, in the only way humans can. And to rest in accordance with nature, to sleep when the body needs sleep, to wake when it needs waking, is to participate in that divinity. This is a different approach from anything you've encountered before. The Pythagoreans saw the threshold state as a way of accessing mathematical truth. Plato saw it as a preparation for the vision of the forms. Aristotle and his followers see it as something simpler and perhaps more profound, a natural phenomenon, to be studied and understood and incorporated into a life lived in accordance with nature. The nap isn't a mystical experience or a spiritual discipline. It's just what happens when a thinking being rests, and that's enough. The path crests a hill and begins to descend toward a small river, its banks lined with plane trees that cast deep shade over the water. The students ahead have already reached the river and are settling themselves on the grass, some lying down immediately, others sitting and talking in low voices. You and Theos find a spot near the water's edge, and you lie back on the soft grass, feeling the coolness rising from the river and the warmth of the sun filtering through the leaves. Theos lies down beside you, close enough to talk but not so close that you feel crowded. Now we rest, he says. Not because we're tired, though we are, a little, but because this is what comes next. The walk generates, the nap integrates. Without the nap, the walk's gifts would be scattered, lost, forgotten. With it, they sink in, take root, become part of us. Watch what happens in the next few minutes. Notice how your mind continues to process the morning's experiences even as you let go of conscious control. That's the peripatetic secret, not just thinking, but allowing thought to complete itself in rest. You close your eyes and let the sounds of the river fill your awareness. Images from the walk drift through your mind. The shrine with its weathered stones, the farmers in their fields, the sea glimpsed in the distance. They blend and shift, forming new combinations, new connections. You're not directing any of this. You're just observing, as Aristotle would say, letting the phenomena present themselves without interference. And in that observation, you begin to understand what Theos meant about integration. The morning's experiences aren't just passing through you. They're becoming part of you, woven into the fabric of your mind, available for future use in ways you can't yet predict. Historians still argue about whether the peripatetic practice of walking and napping was as systematic as Theos describes, or whether this is later idealization, a romantic gloss on what was probably a more casual arrangement. The texts are silent on the details, and the surviving fragments of Theophrastus's own work focus on more conventional philosophical topics. But the logic of the practice is sound, grounded in Aristotle's own observations about the relationship between activity and rest, between motion and stillness. And as you lie here by the river, drifting peacefully towards sleep, you can feel that logic working in your own body and mind. When you open your eyes, 15 minutes later, though you have no way of knowing, Theos is sitting up, watching you with a slight smile. "Good," he says. "You're learning. Now let's walk back and see what the others have to report." And you rise, stretch, and fall into step beside him, heading back toward Athens with a mind that feels somehow fuller than when you left. The painted stoa stands at the edge of the Athenian agora, its colonnade throwing long shadows across the packed earth where merchants and idlers and philosophers alike gather to escape the midday sun. You've heard of this place, everyone in Athens has heard of this place, but you've never had occasion to visit until now. Today, you're here to meet Zeno, the philosopher from Citium who's been gathering followers in this very spot, teaching a new kind of wisdom that seems to be spreading through the city like fire through dry grass. The Stoics, they're calling themselves, after the stoa where they meet, and what they're saying is different enough from anything you've heard before that you had to come see for yourself. Zeno isn't what you expected. He's not old and bearded like the philosophers in the statues, not robed and remote like a figure from another age. He's middle-aged, dressed simply, with the weathered look of a man who's spent time at sea, which he has, having been a merchant before a shipwreck deposited him in Athens and, eventually, in philosophy. Right now he's sitting on the steps of the stoa, surrounded by a small group of listeners, and he's talking about something that makes you stop and pay attention. He's talking about sleep. The common opinion, Zeno says, his voice carrying clearly in the still afternoon air, is that sleep is a loss, a deprivation, a temporary death. We resist it when we should be working, we mourn the hours we spend unconscious, we speak of wasting time in bed. But this is the voice of the passion speaking, not the voice of reason. Sleep is natural. Sleep is necessary. And like all natural things, it can be approached rationally, used wisely, made to serve the good life. You find a spot at the edge of the group and settle onto the warm stones, listening. Zeno notices you but doesn't pause or acknowledge you specially. One of the Stoic principles, you'll learn, is that everyone is equally worthy of attention and equally capable of understanding. Consider the alternative, he continues. To stay awake constantly, to push past exhaustion, to treat sleep as an enemy to be conquered, this is not strength. This is the passions in another form, the desire to prove something, to achieve something, to be something other than what nature intended. The rational person accepts that sleep is part of human life, accepts its necessity, and sleeps when sleep is needed. No more, no less. A young man in the audience raises a hand. But what about the great men, the heroes, the ones who accomplish mighty deeds? Surely they sleep less than ordinary people, driven by their purpose. Zeno shakes his head slowly. You're confusing achievement with virtue. A man can achieve much and still be a fool, driven by ambition or greed or the need for recognition. The wise person achieves what nature requires. Nothing more, nothing less. And nature requires sleep. To deny it is to fight against the order of things, which is always a losing battle. This is different. The philosophers you've encountered so far, the Pythagoreans, Plato, Aristotle, all treated sleep as something to be used, a tool for accessing other states or integrating other experiences. Zeno seems to be saying something simpler and harder, that sleep is just sleep, that its value lies not in what it gives you but in the very fact of accepting it, of surrendering to necessity, of aligning your will with the way things are. It's a humbling message, and you can see why it might appeal to people weary of the endless striving that characterizes so much of Athenian life. Zeno continues for a while, discussing the nature of impressions and assent, the difference between things within our control and things outside it, the importance of living in accordance with nature. Gradually, though, you notice something strange happening. As the afternoon deepens and the shadows lengthen, more and more of his listeners are beginning to drift. Their eyes close, their heads nod, their breathing slows. And Zeno, far from being offended, seems to expect this. He lowers his voice, matches his rhythm to their fading attention, and carries on speaking as if nothing has changed. You catch his eye, questioning. He gives you the smallest of nods, and you understand that this is part of the lesson. The Stoic nap isn't a technique for accessing higher truths or integrating experiences. It's a practice in letting go, in accepting that even the most attentive mind will eventually need rest, in recognizing that your control over your own consciousness has limits. To sleep in the middle of a lecture, surrounded by others who are also sleeping, is to acknowledge that you're not the master of your own existence, that you're part of nature, subject to its laws, dependent on its rhythms. After what feels like a long time but is probably only 15 minutes or so, the sleepers begin to stir. They open their eyes, blink in the afternoon light, and gradually reorient themselves to the world. Zeno has been waiting, patient as stone, and when the last of them is fully awake, he picks up exactly where he left off. And so the wise person accepts what comes, whether it's waking or sleeping, pleasure or pain, life or death. Not because these things are good in themselves, they're not, they're indifferent, but because accepting them is the only rational response to the way things are. To fight against sleep is to fight against nature, and to fight against nature is to guarantee your own misery. You think about this as the gathering disperses, as people rise and stretch and wander off into the city. Zeno remains on the steps, and you approach him, unsure what to say. He saves you the trouble. You're wondering, he says, whether the napping was planned, whether I timed it deliberately, whether it's part of the teaching. You admit that the thought had crossed your mind. Zeno smiles, a rare thing, you'll learn, among Stoics. Planned? No. Expected? Yes. The body has its needs, and those needs will assert themselves whether the mind approves or not. The teaching is in how we respond to them. My students could have fought their drowsiness, pinched themselves, struggled to stay awake. Instead, they let go. They accepted. They slept. And in that acceptance, they practiced the very virtue I was trying to explain. Historians still argue about whether the early Stoics actually incorporated napping into their practice or whether this is a later interpretation, a softening of the school's famously austere image. The texts are ambiguous, and the Stoic emphasis on rational control seems at odds with something as passive as surrendering to sleep. But sitting here on the steps of the painted stoa, watching the afternoon light play across Zeno's weathered face, you're not so sure there's a contradiction. Maybe the highest form of control is knowing when to let go. Maybe the most rational response to the body's needs is simply to meet them, without struggle or complaint, and then return to the work of living well. Zeno rises, brushing dust from his himation. Walk with me, he says. There's something I want to show you. You fall into step beside him as he heads away from the agora, toward the residential streets where ordinary Athenians live their ordinary lives. My students, he continues, often ask me how to practice virtue in the midst of daily life. They think they need special exercises, special techniques, special time set aside for philosophy. And I tell them, you're practicing all the time, whether you know it or not. Every time you eat, you practice temperance or gluttony. Every time you speak, you practice honesty or deception. Every time you sleep, or fight against sleep, you practice acceptance or resistance. The question isn't whether you're practicing. The question is what. You leave the stoa with Zeno's words still echoing in your mind. You're practicing all the time, whether you know it or not, and wander through the streets of Athens with no particular destination in mind. Your feet carry you eastward, away from the crowded agora, away from the philosophical schools and their competing claims on your attention, toward a part of the city you've never visited before. The streets grow quieter here, the buildings smaller and more spread out, and soon you find yourself at the edge of a walled garden that seems to hum with its own particular kind of life. This, you realize, must be the garden, the school of Epicurus, whose name is whispered in some circles and shouted in others, depending on whether the whisperer approves of what they think he teaches. The gate is open, so you step through. Inside, the world changes. The garden is lush with vegetables and herbs and fruit trees, laid out in careful rows but allowed to grow with a certain wildness around the edges. People are everywhere, sitting in the shade, walking the paths, talking in small groups, but there's none of the intense concentration you felt at the Academy or the Lyceum. These people look relaxed, content. Some of them are actually napping, stretched out on simple mats beneath the trees, their faces peaceful in the dappled light. A woman approaches you, smiling, and asks if you're here to see the master. You nod, not sure what else to do, and she leads you through the garden to a spot where an older man sits on a stone bench, feeding figs to a small goat that has somehow gotten inside. Epicurus looks up as you approach, and his face breaks into a grin that crinkles the corners of his eyes. "Another seeker after truth," he says, scratching the goat behind its ears. "Or perhaps another seeker after lunch. Either way, you're welcome. Sit." He gestures to the bench beside him, and you sit, watching as he offers the last fig to the goat and wipes his hands on his himation. "You've been visiting the other schools," he says. "It's not a question. I can tell by the look on your face. That mixture of awe and exhaustion, as if you've been drinking from a stream that runs too fast and too cold. Am I right?" You admit that he is. Epicurus nods, unsurprised. They mean well, most of them. Plato and his forms, Aristotle and his categories, Zeno and his duty. They're all trying to find the good life, each in their own way. But they make it so complicated, so demanding, so exhausting. And the irony is that exhaustion itself is an obstacle to the very thing they're seeking. You cannot live well if you're too tired to enjoy living. He leans back on the bench, stretching his legs out in front of him and closing his eyes against the sun. For a moment you think he's fallen asleep, right there in the middle of the conversation. But then he speaks again, his voice softer now, more distant. "The goal of philosophy, as I see it, is simple: to live pleasantly. Not to pursue every pleasure indiscriminately. That way lies pain, and no one wants that. But to choose wisely among pleasures, to seek those that bring lasting contentment rather than fleeting satisfaction. And one of the greatest pleasures, one of the most reliable sources of contentment, is simply rest. The body's need for sleep, met at the right time and in the right way, is a pleasure in itself. Not a means to something else, not a tool for better thinking or more virtuous living, but a good in its own right." He opens one eye and peers at you. "You've been napping with the philosophers, haven't you? The Pythagoreans use it to access mathematical truth. Plato uses it to glimpse the forms. Aristotle uses it to integrate experience. Zeno uses it to practice acceptance. All worthy goals, I'm sure. But have you ever just napped? Without expecting anything from it, without trying to make it useful, without turning it into another project?" The question lands harder than you expected. Have you? You think back over your experiences. The hillside with Aristotle, the spring with Diotima, the alley with Plato, the bench with Aristotle, the river with Theophrastus, the stoa with Zeno. In every case, the nap was framed as part of something larger, a technique or practice or discipline aimed at some goal beyond itself. But Epicurus is asking something different. He's asking whether you've ever simply rested, for no reason other than that rest feels good. Come, he says, rising from the bench with a slight groan. Let me show you how we do things here. He leads you deeper into the garden, past more napping figures, past small groups engaged in quiet conversation, past a woman reading aloud from a scroll while her listeners eat bread and olives. At the center of the garden, in the shade of a massive olive tree, there's a clearing with several simple mats spread on the grass. Epicurus gestures to one of them, and you lie down, feeling the softness of the woven fibers beneath you, the coolness of the shade, the distant murmur of voices and birds. Epicurus settles onto a mat nearby, not so close that you feel crowded but close enough to talk if you want to. For a while, neither of you speaks. You listen to the sounds of the garden, the rustle of leaves, the buzz of insects, the occasional laugh from somewhere out of sight, and you feel your body relaxing in a way it hasn't in days. The tension you've been carrying, the constant alertness of the seeker after wisdom, begins to drain away. You're not trying to learn anything. You're not trying to achieve anything. You're just lying here, in a garden in Athens, resting. After a time, you're not sure how long, Epicurus speaks again. The other schools will tell you that pleasure is a distraction, that the wise person rises above it, that the body's needs are obstacles to be overcome. But think about that for a moment. If the body's needs are obstacles, then the body itself is an obstacle. And if the body is an obstacle, then life is an obstacle, because life is embodied. You see where this leads? To a hatred of existence itself, a longing to escape into some realm where bodies don't exist and needs don't press. But there is no such realm. There's only here, only now, only this body with its needs and its pleasures and its pains. The question is whether you'll fight against it or learn to live in it peacefully. You think about this as you drift further towards sleep. The boundary between waking and sleeping becomes soft, permeable, and you're aware of your thoughts dissolving into something larger and more diffuse. But unlike your previous threshold experiences, there's no sense of anticipation, no expectation of insight or vision. You're just letting go, surrendering to the simple pleasure of rest. And in that surrender, you feel something you haven't felt in all your philosophical wanderings: peace. Historians still argue about whether Epicurus actually endorsed napping as a philosophical practice or whether this is a later caricature, a way of dismissing his emphasis on pleasure as mere laziness. The surviving texts are fragmentary, and his enemies were many and vocal, eager to portray him as a glutton and a hedonist in the crudest sense. But the fragments we have suggest something more nuanced, a recognition that pleasure comes in many forms, from the highest intellectual satisfactions to the simplest bodily comforts, and that wisdom lies in knowing how to choose among them. And surely, the simple pleasure of resting when tired, without guilt, without expectation, without turning it into something else, would have a place in that scheme. When you open your eyes, the shadows have lengthened and the garden is quieter. Epicurus is still on his mat, but he's awake now, watching you with a gentle expression. Well, he says, did you learn anything? You start to answer, then stop, because you're not sure you did. You didn't have any visions, didn't receive any insights, didn't solve any philosophical problems. You just rested. And somehow, that feels like enough. Epicurus nods, as if you've answered perfectly. Good, he says. You're beginning to understand. The road from Athens to the port of Piraeus is a busy one, crowded with merchants and slaves and travelers from every corner of the Mediterranean, but you're not heading for the ships today. You're heading for a small house on a quiet side street, where a man named Pyrrho has been living since he returned from India with the armies of Alexander the Great. You've heard stories about Pyrrho, that he was accompanied on his travels by a philosopher from the East who taught him to doubt everything, that he lived so consistently according to his principles that his friend had to follow him around to keep him from walking off cliffs, that he once continued talking calmly through a storm at sea while everyone else on the ship was panicking. You're not sure which of these stories to believe, but you've come to find out for yourself. The house is modest, almost shabby, and the man who answers the door looks nothing like a famous philosopher. Pyrrho is thin, weathered, with the kind of face that might belong to a farmer or a sailor, which, you remember, he was before philosophy claimed him. He invites you in without asking who you are or what you want, which seems either incredibly trusting or incredibly indifferent, and leads you to a small courtyard where a couple of students are already sitting on cushions, waiting for the day's discussion to begin. You settle yourself among them, and Pyrrho settles himself on a slightly larger cushion, and for a long moment no one speaks. Finally, one of the students ventures a question. "Master, they say you learned wisdom from the gymnosophists of India. Is it true?" Pyrrho considers this for a moment, then shrugs. "I met some people in India. We talked. Whether they were gymnosophists or something else, whether they taught me anything or I taught them, whether any of it counts as wisdom, these are questions I can't answer with certainty. And that's the point." He looks around at his small audience, his eyes resting on each face in turn. "The problem with most philosophy," he continues, "is that it's too sure of itself. Plato is sure about the forms. Aristotle is sure about his categories. Zeno is sure about virtue. Epicurus is sure about pleasure. But how can they be sure? What grounds do they have for certainty? They weren't there when the universe was created. They haven't seen the forms with their own eyes. They can't prove that virtue is the highest good or that pleasure is the goal of life. They've just decided. And then they've spent their lives defending their decisions, as if deciding something makes it true." You shift uncomfortably on your cushion. This is not what you expected. You came here expecting another system, another set of teachings, another philosopher with another answer. Instead, Pyrrho seems to be saying that there are no answers, or at least, none that anyone can be certain of. It's unsettling, and you can see from the faces of the other students that you're not alone in feeling that way. Pyrrho notices your discomfort and smiles, a gentle smile, not a mocking one. "I know," he says. "It's not comfortable, this suspension of judgment. We want certainty. We want to know what's true and what's false, what's good and what's bad, what matters and what doesn't. But wanting something doesn't make it available. And acting as if we have certainty when we don't, that's not wisdom. That's just pretending." He leans back on his cushion, closing his eyes for a moment. When he opens them, he's looking directly at you. You've been visiting the other schools. You've napped with Pythagoreans and Platonists, with Peripatetics and Stoics and Epicureans. Each one gave you a framework for understanding those naps, a way of making them meaningful. And now you're here, and I'm going to tell you something different. Maybe the naps don't mean anything. Maybe they're just naps. Maybe the quest for meaning is itself the problem. This is the most unsettling thing you've heard yet. Not because it's obviously false, but because it might be true. What if all your wandering, all your seeking, all your experiences on the threshold of sleep have been not a journey toward wisdom but just wandering? What if there's nothing to find? Pyrrho watches you wrestle with this, and when he speaks again, his voice is softer. I'm not saying there's no value in those experiences. I'm just saying we should be honest about what we know and what we don't know. You've had experiences on the edge of sleep, experiences that felt significant, that seemed to reveal something. But what exactly did they reveal? Can you put it into words? Can you prove that what you experienced was true? rather than just a product of your own mind in an unusual state. You try to answer, and you can't. The experiences were real, you know that, but what they meant, what they revealed, whether they were contact with something beyond yourself or just the random firings of a drowsy brain, you have no way of knowing. And the moment you admit that, something shifts. The pressure you've been feeling, the need to understand and categorize and make sense of everything, begins to ease. That's the suspension of judgment, Pyrrho says, watching your face. Epoche, we call it. Not believing, not disbelieving, just holding back. Letting experience be experience without demanding that it means something. And here's the thing about epoche. It's restful. It's a kind of nap for the mind, a release from the endless labor of judging and evaluating and deciding. When you stop trying to figure out what everything means, you free yourself to simply experience it. He stands, stretches, and gestures toward the cushions. Lie down, he says. Nap with us. But this time, don't try to make it mean anything. Don't look for visions or insights or connections to philosophical systems. Just sleep, and when you wake, notice what it feels like to have no conclusions. You lie down on the cushion, feeling the familiar softness beneath you, the warmth of the afternoon sun filtering through the courtyard vines. Your mind, trained now by weeks of practice, begins its familiar drift toward the threshold. But this time, when the images start to come, fragments of your travels, faces of the philosophers you've met, scenes from the streets of Athens, you don't try to interpret them. You don't ask what they mean or where they come from. You just watch them drift by, like clouds crossing the sky, and let them go. Historians still argue about whether Pyrrho actually taught a practice of meditative suspension or whether this is a later development, an influence from the Buddhist traditions he might have encountered in India. The evidence is thin, the connection speculative, and the whole question is tangled up with larger debates about Greek and Indian philosophical exchange in the wake of Alexander's conquests. But what's clear is that the skeptical tradition Pyrrho founded, the school that would later be called Pyrrhonism, placed a high value on mental tranquility, on the peace that comes from letting go of the need for certainty. And what better way to practice that letting go than in the space between waking and sleeping, where judgments naturally dissolve and certainties naturally fade. When you open your eyes, you're not sure how much time has passed. The shadows have moved, but not far. Pyrrho is sitting on his cushion, watching you with that same gentle expression. Well, he says. And you realize, with a start, that you have nothing to report. No insights, no visions, no philosophical breakthroughs. Just rest. Just peace. Just the simple experience of having slept and woken, without any meaning attached. Pyrrho nods, as if this is exactly what he expected. Good, he says. You're learning to let go. Now stay for dinner. We have bread and olives and nothing to prove. You wake the next morning in Pyrrho's modest house, your mind unusually clear and quiet, and you realize that for the first time since arriving in Athens, you have no appointment with a philosopher, no school to visit, no new system to absorb. The day stretches before you empty and open, and you're not sure what to do with it. You wander through the city without direction, letting your feet carry you where they will, and eventually you find yourself at the foot of the Acropolis, looking up at the Parthenon gleaming in the morning sun. But it's not the temples that draw your attention today. It's something else, something you've heard about but never visited. The sanctuary of Asclepius, the healing god, tucked into the south slope of the sacred rock. You've heard stories about the Asclepia, about the sick and suffering who come from all over Greece seeking cures, about the sacred sleep that takes place in the Abaton, the dormitory where the god appears to his suppliants in dreams and prescribes treatments. You've always assumed these stories were for the desperate, the credulous, the ones who had given up on ordinary medicine. But after everything you've experienced in the past weeks, after all those naps on hillsides and in gardens and on philosophers' benches, You're beginning to wonder whether there might be more to it. Whether the healing sleep of Asclepius might have something in common with the philosophical naps you've been practicing. The sanctuary is busier than you expected. Priests in white robes move through the crowds, directing people this way and that. The sick lie on mats in the porticos, waiting their turn for the abaton. The air smells of incense and herbs and the particular odor of human suffering. You make your way through the crowds, not sure what you're looking for, until you come to a small courtyard where a priest is addressing a group of newcomers. You slip in at the back and listen. The God heals in many ways, the priest is saying. Through herbs and diets, through exercise and rest, through the interpretations of his priests. But his most direct healing comes in sleep, in the sacred sleep of the abaton, where he appears to the sufferer and reveals the cure. This is why we purify those who enter, why we prepare them with fasting and prayer, why we create the conditions for the God to visit. Sleep, for us, is not merely rest. It is encounter. A woman in the audience raises a hand. But what if the God doesn't come? What if I sleep and dream and remember nothing? The priest smiles gently. The God always comes. Whether you remember is another matter. Sometimes the cure is given and forgotten, and we must work with the priests to recover it. Sometimes the cure takes time to manifest. Sometimes, he pauses, choosing his words carefully. Sometimes the healing is not of the body but of something deeper, and the God's visit leaves its mark in ways you cannot immediately see. You think about your own naps, your own threshold experiences. You've never thought of them as healing, exactly, but there's no denying that you felt different afterward, clearer, calmer, more present. Is it possible that the philosophers, in their different ways, were tapping into the same ancient wisdom that the priests of Asclepius had been practicing for centuries? That the nap is not just a philosophical tool but a therapeutic one, a way of restoring balance to mind and body? The priest continues his instructions, explaining the rituals of purification, the proper attitude of supplication, the importance of trusting the God's wisdom even when it seems strange. You listen, fascinated, and when the group disperses you approach him with a question. He sizes you up with a glance, not sick, not suffering, just curious, and after a moment hesitation, he agrees to let you observe the evening's incubation, the sacred sleep, from a corner of the abaton where you won't disturb the suppliants. As the sun sets, you find yourself in a long, dimly lit hall lined with simple couches. The suppliants file in one by one, each accompanied by a priest who helps them settle and offers a final prayer. Some are clearly in pain, moving slowly and carefully. Others seem healthy enough but carry something in their eyes, a weight, a worry, a fear that no ordinary medicine can touch. They lie down on their couches, close their eyes, and wait. The priests withdraw, the lamps are dimmed, and silence settles over the hall like a blanket. You find your corner, a shadowed spot where you can observe without being observed, and you settle in to watch. The minutes pass. The breathing of the suppliants deepens and slows, one by one, as sleep takes them. And as they sleep, something strange happens. Or perhaps nothing happens, it's hard to tell. The silence becomes thicker, more present. The air seems to change, to grow heavier with something you can't name. You feel your own eyelids growing heavy, your own consciousness beginning to drift, and you realize that you're being drawn into the same state as the suppliants, whether you intended it or not. You don't fight it. You let yourself go, let yourself drift, let yourself slip beneath the surface of waking awareness. And in that state, on the edge of sleep, you become aware of presences, not gods exactly, not in any form you could describe, but something like attention, something like care, something like wisdom flowing toward the sleepers from a source you can't locate. It's not a dream. It's not a vision. It's just a quality of the moment, a sense that in this place, at this time, something is happening that transcends ordinary explanation. Historians still argue about what actually took place in the abaton of Asclepius. Some say it was simple dream incubation, the same practice found in many cultures around the world. Others suggest that the priests may have used herbs or vapors to induce altered states. A few have proposed that the cures were psychosomatic, effective only for those whose illnesses had psychological roots. But the inscriptions left by grateful suppliants tell a different story. Tales of the blind seeing, the lame walking, the dying restored to health. Whatever was happening in that dormitory, the people who experienced it believed it was real. You come back to yourself slowly, as if rising from deep water. The hall is still dim, still silent, but something has shifted. The suppliants are beginning to stir, to wake, to sit up on their couches with expressions of wonder or confusion or quiet peace. Priests are moving among them, listening to their accounts, interpreting their dreams. And you, in your corner, are left with the lingering sense that you've witnessed something you don't fully understand. Something that connects, somehow, to all those philosophical naps you've been taking. As you slip out of the Abaton into the cool night air, you realize that your own sleep, if that's what it was, lasted about 15 minutes. Long enough to touch the threshold, not long enough to descend into the depths. And in that threshold state, in that sacred space, you felt something you've never felt before. Not insight, not vision, not philosophical understanding, but simply presence. The presence of something larger than yourself, something that cares, something that heals. Whether that something was Asclepius or the collective attention of the priests or simply the power of human hope in a sacred space, you can't say. But you know it was real. Morning light filters through the columns of the Asclepian as you make your way back through the sanctuary, past the grateful inscriptions left by those the god has healed, past the priests already busy with the day's suppliants, past the sacred snakes that slumber in their baskets near the temple entrance. You're heading not for the Abaton this time but for something you've been curious about since your first night in Athens, the actual furniture of sleep. You've napped on hillsides and benches, on mats and cushions, on the bare ground and the warm stones of philosophical schools. But you've never really considered the objects beneath you, the things the Greeks actually lie on when they rest, and today you've arranged to meet someone who thinks about little else. His name is Dorus, and he's a furniture maker who supplies couches and beds to half the wealthy households in Athens. You find him in his workshop near the Kerameikos, the potter's quarter, surrounded by the tools of his trade. Saws and chisels and planes, lengths of wood in various stages of carving, bundles of reeds and ropes and wool waiting to become mattresses and cushions. He's a big man, Dorus, with arms like cables and the kind of hands that have spent decades shaping wood, and when he greets you his grip makes you wince. So, he says, gesturing around the workshop, you want to know about sleeping furniture. Not many people ask. They just want to buy, to own, to have the finest couch in their symposium room. But you're different. You want to understand. He leads you to a corner where several finished pieces stand waiting for their owners. A magnificent bed of carved ivory and cedar, a simple couch of olive wood with rope supports, a folding stool that somehow looks both practical and elegant. This is what we make. This is what they lie on. And if you want to understand Greek sleep, you have to understand Greek furniture. He hands you a small cushion stuffed with something that crackles when you squeeze it. Reeds, he says. Dried and chopped fine. Cheaper than wool, cooler in summer, and they hold their shape longer if they're good quality. The wealthy use wool, softer, warmer, more comfortable. But wool packs down over time, needs constant fluffing and replacing. Reeds last for years if they're properly prepared. And between us, he lowers his voice conspiratorially. Reeds are better for napping. Wool is too soft, too enveloping. You sink in, you lose yourself, you fall into deep sleep instead of hovering on the threshold. The philosophers know this. That's why most of them use reed-stuffed cushions for their midday rests. You think about all those naps, on hillsides, by springs, in gardens, and realize that you've rarely been lying on anything soft. The philosophers, whether by design or instinct, have been giving you exactly the right surface for the threshold state. Firm enough to keep you from sinking too deep, supportive enough to let you relax completely. Doru's nods when you share this observation. They're clever, those philosophers. They think about everything. I've had orders from most of them. Plato's Academy alone keeps me busy with their clinae, and they always have specifications. This thick, this firm, this kind of stuffing. They know exactly what they want. He leads you to a couch in progress, its wooden frame assembled but not yet finished, the ropes that will support the mattress still loose and waiting to be tightened. This is a Klein, he explains. Standard symposium couch, but also used for sleeping. The frame is maple, strong, flexible, takes a nice finish. The ropes are linen, twisted tight, then woven into a grid that supports the mattress. Too loose, and you sag, you sink, you wake with a sore back. Too tight, and it's like sleeping on a board, no give at all. The trick is getting it exactly right for the sleeper's weight and sleeping habits. Which means I have to know my customers. Have to watch them sleep, sometimes, to see how they move, how they settle, how they rest. You must look surprised, because Doru's laughs. Oh yes, I watch them sleep. Not in a creepy way. I'm a craftsman, I need to understand my materials. I'll visit a customer's house, have dinner with them, stay late, and when they start to nod off on their current couch, I watch. How do they arrange themselves? Do they curl up or stretch out? Do they toss and turn or lie still as stone? Do they snore? All of it matters. All of it tells me what kind of support they need. Then I go back to the workshop and build them something that fits like a second skin. You think about this as you examine the couch more closely. The wood is smooth under your hand, the joints precise, the overall effect one of elegant simplicity. This is not a piece of furniture that shouts for attention. It's a piece that does its job quietly, reliably, allowing the sleeper to forget it entirely and focus on the more important work of resting. And that, Doru explains, is the whole point. The best couch is the one you don't notice, he says. The one that supports you without making you think about being supported. The one that lets you drift off without any awareness of the transition. You're lying there awake, and then you're not, and you never felt yourself cross the boundary. That's what I'm trying to build. That's what all the philosophers want, whether they know it or not. A couch that disappears, that becomes nothing, that leaves the sleeper alone with sleep. He gestures to a stack of finished mattresses in the corner. Those are for the academy. Plato ordered a dozen last month. New ones for the students who've been complaining about the old ones being too hard. But here's the thing. I made them exactly the same as the old ones. Same stuffing, same thickness, same everything. Because the old ones weren't too hard. They were perfect. The students just needed something to complain about, something to blame for their own restlessness. So I gave them new mattresses that are identical to the old ones, and now they sleep fine. The mind is a strange thing, isn't it? Historians still argue about the details of ancient Greek sleeping furniture, the exact construction methods, the typical materials, the variations between households and regions. Archaeological evidence is limited, texts are ambiguous, and the few surviving fragments are difficult to interpret. But what's clear is that the Greeks thought carefully about where and how they slept, and that the philosophers among them had particular preferences shaped by their understanding of the threshold state. A couch that was too soft would plunge you into deep sleep, cutting you off from the visions and insights that came only at the boundary. A couch that was too hard would keep you awake, prevent you from crossing over at all. The ideal was somewhere in between, firm enough to support, soft enough to release, and the best craftsmen, like Doru's, spent their lives trying to hit that exact spot. Doru's hands you a small cushion, stuffed with chopped reeds, and gestures to a finished couch against the wall. Try it, he says. Lie down, see how it feels. This is what the philosophers use, or what they should use, if they know what's good for them. You lie down, settling onto the firm surface, feeling the reeds shift slightly beneath you but hold their shape. It's comfortable but not luxurious, supportive but not rigid, and within moments you feel your body beginning to relax, your mind beginning to drift. This, you realize, is exactly what you've been experiencing all along. The physical foundation of all those philosophical naps, the silent partner in every threshold state. Doruz watches you for a moment, then turns back to his work. 15 minutes, he says over his shoulder. That's what they all take. Long enough to rest, not long enough to lose the thread. I'll wake you when it's time. You leave Doruz's workshop with the smell of wood shavings in your clothes and a new appreciation for the physical foundations of philosophical sleep. But your time in Athens is drawing to a close. Word has reached you that a ship is leaving for Rome in 3 days, and something, curiosity, restlessness, the same impulse that brought you to Greece in the first place, is pulling you toward that new city, that rising power, that place where Greek philosophy is being translated and transformed and, some say, diluted beyond recognition. You book your passage and spend your last days wandering familiar streets, saying silent goodbyes to the places where you've learned to nap in the company of sages. The voyage is long but uneventful, and you have plenty of time to think about what awaits you. Rome, you've heard, is not Athens. It's a city of soldiers and administrators, of practical men who value action over contemplation, of a language that has no word for many of the philosophical concepts you've spent weeks exploring. The Greeks who live there, and there are many, teachers and physicians and artists drawn by Roman wealth and Roman curiosity, speak of their new home with a mixture of gratitude and condescension, grateful for the opportunities, condescending about the culture that provides them. You're not sure what to expect, but you're determined to find out whether the art of the philosophical nap has survived the journey across the sea. The ship docks at Ostia, the port of Rome, and you make your way up the Tiber toward the city itself. The landscape is different here, broader, flatter, more ordered than the rugged hills of Greece. And the city, when you finally enter it through the Servian wall, is overwhelming in a way Athens never was. The buildings are larger, the crowds denser, the noise constant and inescapable. You push through the streets, looking for something familiar, and eventually you find it. A small school tucked between a bakery and a fullery, where a Greek teacher named Posidonius is said to lecture on philosophy to anyone who will listen. The school is nothing like the Academy or the Lyceum. It's a single room, cramped and dim, with wooden benches that look like they were built by someone who'd never actually sat on one. But the students are there, a dozen young Romans in togas that mark them as citizens, and the teacher is there, a Greek with the weathered face of a man who spent too many years away from home. You slip onto a bench at the back and listen as Posidonius finishes a sentence about the nature of the soul. And so the Stoics are correct that the soul is material, a kind of fiery breath that pervades the body. But they are wrong, I think, to deny that it can survive death. The evidence from dreams, from prophetic visions, from the experiences of those who have hovered on the edge of sleep. He stops, noticing you in the back. Ah, a new face. And a Greek face, unless I miss my guess. Welcome, brother. We were just discussing the threshold between waking and sleeping, a topic dear to the hearts of my countrymen. Perhaps you have something to contribute. You shake your head, not ready to speak, and Posidonius continues. As I was saying, the evidence from the threshold state, the Greeks call it in cosmosis, the Pythagoreans made it central to their philosophy, suggests that the soul is capable of perceptions that the waking mind cannot access. My Roman students find this difficult to accept. They are practical people, these Romans. They want to know what use it is, what benefit it provides, how it can help them in their careers and their families and their duties to the state. He sighs, a sound that carries generations of frustration. They cannot simply rest and see what comes. They must always be doing, always be achieving, always be measuring. For them, a nap is a waste of time unless it produces something measurable. One of the Roman students, a young man with the self-assured look of the aristocracy, raises a hand. But master, is that not a fair question? If this threshold state reveals truth, what truth has it revealed? Can you point to a single discovery, a single insight, a single piece of knowledge that came from napping and could not have come from waking thought? Posidonius considers this for a moment, then shakes his head slowly. No, he admits. I cannot. And that is precisely the point. The knowledge that comes in that state is not the kind that can be pointed to, measured, or used. It is knowledge of a different order, knowledge of being, not of doing, knowledge of the self, not of the world. Knowledge that transforms the knower rather than adding to his store of facts. Can your Roman mind accept that? The student frowns, clearly wrestling with something his education has not prepared him to handle. I don't know, he says finally. I want to say yes, because I respect you and I respect the Greek tradition. But everything I've been taught, everything my culture values, tells me that knowledge must be useful, must lead to action, must have some practical application. If this threshold knowledge has none of those things, what good is it? Posidonius looks at you, and you see in his eyes the weariness of a man who has had this conversation many times before. You see, he says quietly, this is what we face in Rome. They want philosophy to serve them, not to transform them. They want tools, not wisdom. And the nap, the simple, useless, beautiful nap, is the hardest thing of all to explain to such people. After the lecture, you stay behind to talk with Posidonius. He's curious about your travels, about the philosophers you've met, about the naps you've taken in all those different schools. And as you describe your experiences, the mathematical visions of the Pythagoreans, the form glimpses with Plato, the integrative rests with Aristotle, the acceptance practices with Zeno, the pure pleasure with Epicurus, the suspension with Pyrrho, the healing sleep at Asclepius, he listens with an expression of mingled recognition and longing. It's all disappearing, he says finally. Not the practices themselves. Those will continue, in private, among those who understand. But the public philosophy, the shared understanding, the sense that these practices are part of a larger way of life, that's fading. The Romans don't want it. They want ethics, rules for living, advice on how to manage their households and their careers. They have no patience for the mystery, the threshold, the useless wisdom that comes only when you stop trying to be useful. And so we Greeks, here in Rome, are becoming something we never were in Greece. Teachers of morality, not seekers after truth. Historians still argue about what happened to Greek philosophy when it encountered Roman power. Some say it was diluted, simplified, stripped of its mystical elements to become a practical guide for living. Others argue that the Romans preserved what was best, focusing on ethics and leaving aside the speculative excesses that had led Greek philosophy into dead ends. Still others see a more complex process of translation and transformation, in which Greek ideas were adapted to Roman contexts and emerged changed but not necessarily diminished. What's clear is that something was lost, a certain openness to experience, a willingness to rest in not knowing, an appreciation for the threshold state as a source of wisdom rather than just a biological necessity. You spend the next few days visiting other Greek teachers in Rome, and everywhere you find the same story. The naps continue. How could they not? The body still needs rest, and 15 minutes in the middle of the day still refreshes. But the philosophy has drained out of them. They're just naps now, breaks from the business of Roman life, not doorways to anything deeper. And you realize, with a pang of something like grief, that you've arrived too late. The art of the philosophical nap, as you've experienced it in Athens, is already becoming a memory. You've been in Rome for weeks now, and the city's relentless energy has begun to wear on you in ways you didn't expect. The noise, the crowds, the constant pressure to be doing something useful. It all stands in such sharp contrast to the quiet hillsides and shaded gardens of Athens that you sometimes feel you're living in two different worlds. You've continued visiting the Greek teachers scattered across the city, listening to their lectures, observing their practices, but something is missing. The naps you take in their schools, and you still take them, out of habit if nothing else, feel empty compared to what you experienced in Greece. They refresh the body but not the soul. And you find yourself longing for something you can't quite name. It's in this mood that you find yourself one evening in the library of a wealthy Roman named Pomponius Atticus, a man known for his love of Greek culture and his collection of philosophical texts. Atticus has invited you to dinner, along with several other Greeks and Philhellenes, and after the meal he leads you to his library to show off his latest acquisitions. The room is magnificent, scrolls lining every wall, arranged in niches with labels in both Greek and Latin, reading tables with comfortable chairs, lamps ready to be lit for those who want to study into the night. You wander among the shelves, pulling out scrolls at random, when you notice something that makes your heart stop. The label reads, "On Sleep and Waking," by Theophrastus. Theophrastus, Aristotle's successor, the man who walked with you by the river and explained the peripatetic practice of napping after walking. You've never heard of this work, never seen it mentioned in any of the lists of his writings. Your hands trembling slightly, you take down the scroll and unroll it on one of the reading tables. The text is fragmentary, damaged at the edges, but enough remains to be read. And what you read confirms everything you've suspected, everything you've experienced, everything the philosophers have taught you about the threshold state. Theophrastus writes about the relationship between walking and napping, about the optimal duration of rest, about the kinds of images that appear in the hypnagogic state and what they might mean. He describes experiments, Aristotle's influence clear in every line, in which subjects were woken at different points in the sleep cycle and asked to report their experiences. He speculates about the physiological basis of dreams, about the role of digestion in sleep, about the connection between rest and memory. And embedded in all this careful observation, there are hints of something more, references to the teachings of the older philosophers on the threshold state, mentions of practices now lost or forgotten. A sense that Theophrastus is writing at the end of an era, trying to preserve knowledge that might otherwise disappear. You read for hours, ignoring the dinner guests, ignoring Atticus when he comes to check on you, ignoring everything except the words on the scroll. And when you finally reach the end, or rather, the point where the scroll breaks off, the rest lost to whatever fire or flood or simple neglect destroyed it, you sit back with a feeling you can't quite name. Loss, certainly. Grief, maybe. But also wonder, because here, in this Roman library, you found proof that what you experienced in Athens was real. That the philosophers did have practices, did teach techniques, did understand the threshold state in ways that went beyond casual observation. That there was, once, a whole body of knowledge about the art of the 15-minute nap. Atticus finds you still sitting at the table, the scroll open before you, lost in thought. "Remarkable, isn't it?" he says softly. "I paid a fortune for that scroll, and I've never regretted it." Theophrastus at his best, observant, systematic, full of insights you won't find anywhere else. But here's the thing. It's the only copy I've ever seen. I've asked every bookseller in Rome, every scholar who visits, everyone who might know. No one has heard of it. No one has another copy. As far as I can tell, this is it, the sole surviving witness to a work that must have been known and read in its time. You ask him how he came by it. He shrugs. A merchant brought it from Athens about 10 years ago. Said he'd acquired it from a family whose house had burned, who was selling what little remained to raise money for rebuilding. There were other scrolls, I bought those too, but most were damaged beyond reading. This one was intact, or nearly so. I've had it restored, copied, treated with all the care such a treasure deserves. but I've never been able to find any reference to it in other sources. It's as if Theophrastus wrote it and the world forgot. Historians still argue about how much ancient knowledge has been lost. The library at Alexandria, the scrolls from Athens, the private collections destroyed in fires and wars, and the simple neglect of heirs who didn't care, the scale of the loss is almost unimaginable. We have fragments, echoes, quotations in later authors, but the vast majority of what the Greeks wrote is gone forever. And among that lost knowledge, almost certainly, were entire treatises on sleep, on dreams, on the threshold state, works that would have answered questions we're still asking, that would have confirmed or corrected everything we think we know about ancient practices. You spend the rest of the night with that scroll, reading and rereading, memorizing passages, trying to absorb every word. And as the dawn light begins to filter through the library's high windows, you realize something. You've become a link in a chain. The knowledge in this scroll, the observations of Theophrastus, the practices of Aristotle, the wisdom of generations of Greek thinkers, has survived, barely, through this single copy. And now it's in you, carried in your memory, ready to be passed on if you can find anyone willing to receive it. Atticus finds you still at the table as the servants begin to stir, preparing for the day. You stayed all night, he says. Not quite a question. You nod. Your voice gone from hours of silence. He smiles. A sad smile that understands more than it says. That's what the best scrolls do. They take you somewhere else, somewhere you don't want to leave. And when you finally have to return, you're not quite the same person who left. He offers to have a copy made for you, but you decline. What would you do with it? You have no library, no servants to guard it, no safe place to keep it from the fires and floods and forgetfulness that claim everything eventually. Better to carry it in your mind, in your practice, in the naps you'll take for the rest of your life. Better to be the living scroll, the embodied memory of what the Greeks knew about the threshold state. As you leave Atticus's house, stepping out into the Roman morning with its noise and its crowds and its relentless demand for usefulness, you feel the weight of that scroll in your memory. Theophrastus's words are there, waiting to be recalled. The practices he described are there, waiting to be performed. And you realize that your journey isn't over. It's just entered a new phase. You're no longer just a seeker after wisdom. You're now also a bearer of it, a link between a vanishing past and whatever future might be open to receive what you've learned. You leave Rome the next day, not because you want to but because you have to. The restlessness that brought you to Greece and then to Italy has returned, and you know better now than to ignore it. You book passage on a ship heading east, not back to Athens but to somewhere else, somewhere you've never been, somewhere the philosophers haven't reached yet. The ship is small and crowded, the voyage long and uncomfortable, but you don't mind. You have Theophrastus's words in your memory, and you have the practice that those words describe, and you have the long days at sea to integrate everything you've learned. You nap on the deck, in the shade of the sail, with the sound of waves and the creak of timbers replacing the cicadas and the philosophers' voices. 15 minutes at a time, never more, never less, hovering on that threshold where the mind releases its grip and something else takes over. The images that come are different now, less philosophical, less freighted with meaning, simpler and somehow deeper. You see faces from your journey, Ariston on the hillside, Diotima by the spring, Plato in the alley, Aristotle at the Lyceum, Zeno at the Stoa, Epicurus in his garden, Pyrrho in his courtyard, the priests at Asclepius, Dorus in his workshop, Posidonius in his cramped Roman school, Atticus in his library with the precious scroll. They drift through your mind like clouds, like waves, like the images Theophrastus described in his lost treatise, and you let them come and go without grasping, without interpreting, without trying to make them mean something. The ship reaches its destination, a small port on the coast of Asia Minor, nothing special, just another place where people live and work and sleep. You disembark, find a room in a modest inn, and begin the slow process of making a life in this new place. You don't teach philosophy. You don't start a school. You don't write down what you've learned. You just live, and as you live, you nap, 15 minutes in the middle of every day, wherever you happen to be, whatever you happen to be doing. The locals think you're strange, but they're used to strange, and after a while they stop noticing. Years pass. You grow older, your hair grayer, your steps slower. The naps continue, as regular as the tides, as reliable as the sun. And something happens during those naps, something you never expected. They stop being about philosophy altogether. The threshold state, which once seemed like a doorway to mathematical truth or divine vision or philosophical insight, becomes simply itself. A rest. A pause. A space between doing and not doing, between waking and sleeping, between one thing and the next. You no longer expect anything from it, no longer try to use it for anything, no longer measure it against any standard. You just lie down, close your eyes, and let whatever happens happen. And in that letting go, you finally understand what all those philosophers were really teaching. Not techniques for accessing higher truths. Not methods for integrating experience. Not practices for cultivating virtue or pleasure or acceptance. Something simpler and harder. The art of being present to whatever is, without grasping, without judging, without needing it to be other than it is. The nap, the 15-minute nap, is just an occasion for that presence. A regular reminder that you don't always have to be doing, striving, achieving, becoming. Sometimes you can just be. Sometimes you can just rest. Sometimes you can just close your eyes and let the world go on without you for a while. You think back to all those philosophers, each with their system, each with their claims, each with their certainty about what the threshold state meant and how it should be used. And you realize that they were all right, in their way, and all wrong too. The threshold state can be all those things. A source of mathematical insight, a glimpse of the forms, an integrative space, a practice of acceptance, a pure pleasure, a suspension of judgment, a healing encounter. But it doesn't have to be any of them. It can just be what it is, a rest, a pause, a moment of not doing in the midst of a life that demands constant doing. And that's enough. That's more than enough. One afternoon, as you're lying on your mat in the shade of a fig tree, drifting toward that familiar threshold, you feel something shift. Not dramatically, nothing dramatic ever happens in this state, but subtly, gently, like a door opening onto a room you've always known was there but never entered. The images that come are not images at all, but something else, a sense of completion, of circle closing, of journey's end. You see yourself on that first hillside outside Athens, drowsy and confused, not knowing what you were getting into. You see yourself in all the places you've been, with all the teachers you've met, taking all those naps. And you see yourself here, now, at the end of the journey, still napping, still resting, still present. You open your eyes. The fig tree rustles overhead. A goat bleats somewhere in the distance. The afternoon sun warms your face. And you realize that you have nothing left to seek, nothing left to prove, nothing left to understand. The journey is over, and it has brought you exactly where you started. Lying on the ground, in the middle of the day, with nothing to do and nowhere to go. Which is exactly where you need to be. Historians still argue about whether the philosophical nap ever really existed as a formal practice, or whether it was just something individual thinkers did without system or theory. The evidence is fragmentary, the interpretations contested, and the whole question may be unanswerable. But as you lie here, in the shade of this fig tree, you know what you know. You've lived it. You've practiced it. You've become it. And that knowledge is enough. Now, as the afternoon deepens around you and the world grows quiet, you feel your eyes growing heavy once more. Not because you're tired, you're not really, but because this is what you do, this is who you've become. 15 minutes, no more, no less. Just enough to rest, just enough to reset, just enough to remember what matters. You close your eyes, and the threshold opens to receive you, and you cross it not as a seeker after truth but as someone who has finally learned to rest in not knowing. The philosophers are with you still, Aristotle and Diotima, Plato and Aristotle, Zeno and Epicurus and Pyrrho, all the others you've met along the way. They're not teaching now, not explaining, not claiming. They're just present, as you are present, resting in the space between waking and sleeping, between seeking and finding, between one breath and the next. And in that space, there's nothing left to say. So let the journey end here, in this quiet place, with the fig tree overhead and the afternoon light softening toward evening. Let the voice that's guided you through all these naps grow softer, slower, more distant, until it's just a murmur, just a memory, just the faintest echo of words that once seemed so important. Let yourself drift, finally and completely, into the rest you've been seeking all along. Because this is what the Greeks knew, what they tried to teach in all their different ways. That wisdom is not something you find at the end of a journey. It's something you carry with you, something you practice, something you become. And sometimes, the wisest thing you can do is simply close your eyes and let the world go on without you for a while.